Thanks, everyone. Emily, thank you for the generous introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers, Emily and your team, and Lennart at Lund, for bringing all of us here together. Of course, Richard and Rachel, and all of you from Oxford and the UK Met Service, Reinhard and your team from IIASA, partners who may not be here, but who have played an important role in our conversation over the years, Thomas Loster from Unicre Foundation and his team, and of course, ECUT. As Emily said, I'm coming from the policy space, the UNFCCC, and we see many of you at our meetings. You're known to us, and you're very important. Last week, we had the executive committee, our 10th meeting, and as some of you know, we'll have our Conference of the Parties in Santiago de Chile in the coming weeks, and it's a pretty important moment right now for loss and damage and for our international mechanism. It's called the Warsaw International Mechanism. I'll say a few words about that, but we talked about this conference, and we know you, or at least you're known to us, and your research and contributions make it quite important that you help us move forward and the work of the XCOM, so thank you for that. To get started, where are we right now? Countries actually don't care too much about climate change, obviously, or would be doing more. I don't say that in a flippant way, but what countries really want is they really want well-being for the people living in their country. So we talk a lot about sustainable development, and that's what countries make their decisions based on. They want a good life broadly for the people who live in their national boundaries. And science has a really important role to play. Science can provide the insights and is providing insights in all kinds of things, water management, health, etc. That's just to name one of or two of thousands. So science provides insights that help improve human welfare. Where does climate change feature? The adverse effects of climate change are getting in the way of sustainable development. And as we move forward and as we learn more about those profound impacts, it may be, I've heard in some meetings, that it could be, depending on how far we go with climate change and depending on our choices around mitigation, that sustainable development, as we think of it today, may be out of reach. That's a dramatic thing to say. But when we look at some of the literature that the IPCC special reports have assessed, you start having an emerging understanding of what will it mean to feed however many billions of people we will be in the coming decades? How will cities that are growing in coastal areas provide fresh water and services to people who are right now flocking to those areas for opportunities or for lack of opportunities in other areas? There are three levels that I wanted to mention where climate change and the adverse impacts can get in the way. Some of you know this. This is our kind of pretend landscape to help people start understanding what we're talking about when we think about adverse impacts of climate change. I'll say that phrase a lot. What's behind this is loss and damage. But in the policy space, we don't really, we need to further develop the concept of loss and damage. We have no definition, which you wouldn't expect coming out of a political discussion. So what we're talking about are a whole variety of interacting factors. So we have economic losses, non-economic losses. I'll just pick out a few to walk us through this. We have maybe losses of income, climate impacts, these adverse impacts if you are a small island state and you have a thriving tourism industry. People come to enjoy your beautiful coral reefs. Coral reefs are there's some of the biomes that are most acutely threatened by even relatively small changes in temperature. And we see that already. The special reports that have come out in the last year, 3 of them have repeatedly emphasized that coral reefs are imminently threatened by climate change and maybe irreversibly so. What would that mean if you have 70% of your national income coming in through tourism? What if so many people are engaged in tourism? What does that mean for you, and what do you do next? So these are some of the questions. In terms of non-economic losses, they may be even more profound, and we know perhaps even less about some of these. What about societal and cultural identity? Take your pick. There are all kinds of Biomes, for example, although I'm not from Germany, I live there. It's a forested country. Maybe this part of the world also, the biome is forest. What would happen if that biome changed, perhaps permanently, from a forest to a grassland? What would that mean for the cultural identities of the people who live there? Again, small island development states are often talked about and often kind of on the forefront of a lot of these discussions. What would it mean for you living in a low-lying island state, perhaps out in the Pacific, if your aquifer is polluted with salt water? Perhaps permanently. What would that mean for you? Would it mean that you go somewhere else, or that you stay, but you stay in a whole new kind of way of living? So these physical and social impacts interact, and this is one of the big challenges. They often interact in ways that we're not yet prepared to think about. For example, 2 summers ago, all of the northern hemisphere, at least, pardon me, I'm often a little bit focused on the news that I'm reading where I live, but Germany had a very dry, very hot summer, and the Rhine, which flows about 1 kilometer from where I live, was so low that shipping was really impeded. And one of the impacts that was making the news was a very large chemical company upriver, so it was somewhere around Basel, wasn't able to deliver upstream. And that had impacts, of course, on the company. They had to cut production. It caused, what the company tried to do was to put their products on the roads. So that caused an increase, or it contributed to an increase in fuel prices, and it showed up in GDP and all of these things. Some of us hadn't been thinking of those adverse impacts of climate change. We often think of, oh, the river's low. And often your thoughts go to agriculture, but you don't necessarily think about shipping and other things. So we have a lot to learn about how all of these factors interact and what that means for our society. So there's physical and social disruption. Another impact that we have where we really need more research is decision-making under uncertainty. In our process, UNFCCC, and perhaps even more so at the national and subnational level, countries and other decision makers want to know, when do these XYZ changes happen? When in time? What does that mean for our election cycle? At what rate will these factors interact? For example, again, sorry, the Germany thing, because I live there. I'm, brushing my teeth in the morning, listening to the news. This summer, there was a report put out by essentially the German Federation of Foresters, and combinations of very heavy, extremely cold winters, dry summers, heat stress, have caused millions and millions of trees to either fall susceptible, they're sick, they're not doing well, and many, many trees are dying. And some are already asking, does this mean the biome is starting to collapse? What does that mean? And decision makers need to know, how do slow and extreme events interact? What's the rate of change? And what do they need to get prepared for? They need to know what to do. I may be kind of repeating myself on this, but next year at our COP, COP26, which will be in Glasgow, finance will be under discussion, among many other topics. If you were a country or a city or whatever other level of governance you are, what do you need to do, and what would you actually ask for? Asking for support for loss and damage is one thing. Asking for more specific things. Let's say you are a country, take any of them here. Let's say you've got salinization, land and forest degradation, and maybe, some cultural heritage. Combine those factors and talk to a finance institution and say, we need help to do X, Y, Z in very specific terms. That's the direction we need to go when we're talking about support. To help avert, minimize, and address these adverse impacts. How do things get done? There's much more literature that we need from you as a research community that tells us what's been done, what's worked, what hasn't worked well. That how question is something that decision makers are asking. Who's involved? What do people think? What do they value? And where are these impacts occurring? one challenge that many of us struggle with is when we think about adverse impacts of climate change, the world of disaster risk management, we're building on their shoulders, and we understand disruptions often from the frame of something that's spatially and temporally specific. And a storm happening in my particular territory. But what happens if you're talking about aquifers, fresh water for coastal cities? What happens if an area upstream, maybe in a different municipality or even a different country, changes their forestry practices? And the forest that absorbs the water and lets the water go into your aquifer is now, that land is used for something else. Do we think about climate impacts in those terms? Where do the impacts occur? And what's the system and those systematic kind of interactions? That's all stuff that we need to know more about. And hopefully you as researchers can help us learn these things so that policymakers are more informed. And there will always be uncertainty, but more specificity is needed now more than ever. And maybe a final and very significant challenge that countries face as they try to provide a good life for the people that are living in their territories, and these climate impacts are unfolding, are values. Ultimately, climate change is a symptom of what we value. Everything, the life that we have around us is very fossil fuel intensive. Are there ways that we can think what we value and what makes a good life? That's one question. And another is about risk tolerance. I'll mention this again in just a minute, but what does society care about? And what are different societies willing to do? And when do those values change? What we're looking at with this kind of make-believe landscape is profound change. And that affects us. Most of us think about towards the end of our life. Some of us will think about, when I retire, I'm going to do this. Or for those of you who have kids, you imagine them growing up and getting an education and maybe having a life of their own. What will that future look like? It's just a few decades away. What would adverse impacts of climate change look like? What do you value? And what do we need to do together as society in order to keep that on the table? Well, so these are some of the challenges. UNFCCC understands these challenges on a day-to-day basis. We're working with national governments, and we have this policy cycle. So every 3 months, one or the other of our committees is meeting. My privilege is to work with a couple of those committees, one on local communities and Indigenous people. Today, the one that we're talking about is the Executive Committee on Loss and Damage. And they meet, they prepare decisions, and then they meet in June and at the end of the year to make decisions. Just a quick word about the institution, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage that has this executive committee. Many of you know it. Many of you know the people. The WIM was set up. WIM is Warsaw International Mechanism. The WIM was set up to help countries avert, minimize, and address these types of adverse impacts of climate change. And it's especially focused on vulnerable countries. And with the help of research, you play a very important role in the work that we do. That's the work that we're trying to do. The WIM is under review at COP25. And a review means you have a moment as observers, that's what you guys are all called, and as parties are countries, to evaluate what's gone well under this mechanism and how does it need to be enhanced in the future. And that will happen in just a few weeks. So keep an eye on this. If you have views, I'll give you some information about how you can express those views, but we're interested. So what could you do as research? Now I have two segments. I'm going to give you a plan, and then I'm going to ask you to do some stuff. So first of all, there are, I think I won't get to this. We'll do this in just a minute. So first of all, in terms of research, we're looking for research that will characterize what the adverse impacts of climate change look like in specificity. So we need specifics. We need more understanding about barriers to adaptation, what gets in the way. There's a lot of research at a very small scale, a lot of really great social science research. It's fantastic. We need more multidisciplinary research. We need, as always, scaled research. It's very good to have some global understanding, but the more that gets down to the area that links up with implementation, the more helpful that can be for policymakers. I know it's a big ask, but I'm just telling you what's necessary. We need a characterization of these interactions between adverse impacts of climate change. Because as you are writing your research, policymakers are making decisions, and it would be ideal if they could be informed by your research. A big area that's not in this kind of bucket of characterization, something that we do not yet understand, what happens when society starts changing its objectives. And you hear me making a little bit of a tip of the hat to chapter 16 from the 5th assessment report. It was a very nice kind of theoretical framework about the limits of adaptation. We need to understand better what happens when countries or municipalities or regions start changing their objectives, and what happens next, and what affects the choices that different decision makers make about, okay, maybe this sounds dramatic, but maybe food security all around the year is no longer possible. We need to understand more about those limits, if they are there, and what happens next. Do people switch crops and consume something different? Do they educate themselves differently and move somewhere else? We don't know. And hopefully you could help us with those kinds of questions. A second big area that is underserved so far in research, which would be really useful for policy, is to understand risk tolerance. When do climate impacts occur, at what rate, and what do people think about those? Some options to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage may be acceptable for some societies, and for others, not acceptable at all. We need to understand what people value and what's acceptable or not. And one of the reasons for that is in the international or national or municipal policy space, options on the table, if people don't accept them, you will get a growing kind of schism between what we're talking about in policy and what people are willing to accept. All over the world, you see youth on the streets, particularly youth, saying, hey, there's no planet B. I loved Emily, your slide. People need options that are both acceptable and not business as usual. Obviously, that's a really hard needle to thread, and so we need some ideas from research about risk tolerance. And the third is decision support. That research which helps us understand scenarios, what different futures could look like in some specificity, is very helpful. We need a new type. I'll take one example. In the IPCC, through the 5th assessment report, let's take the example of economics. Some of the literature that's been assessed has been environmental economics, which has often told the tale, climate change is bad and it will affect your GDP probably negatively. What would be increasingly helpful is a broader range of literature that helps us understand further dimensions of economics. What would adverse impacts of climate change mean for real estate markets, for a wide array of investments, for transactions, for finance, for people's livelihoods? GDP is something that's widely used. What additional literature could provide more information for decision support? And an end. And now the call for action. There are 3 things that you as researchers could consider in this conference and moving forward. And there'll be a lot to talk about here, but one is escape the constraints of today. If anything, research is about curiosity and imagination. We need to think about the frontiers of resilience. The Sustainable Development Goals are very worthy, there's no question. We're trying, good morning, we're trying to solve the problems of the 20th century by 2030. And they're very, very important issues to solve: poverty, hunger, water, life on land, life on the oceans, etc. Our world is changing so rapidly. What will things look like after 2020? And what kinds of milestones do we need to start reaching for now? And so I'd invite all of us to open your imaginations. It's easy for me to say. I know that you already are. But the more that we can think about the frontiers of resilience and not be constrained by the way things are currently organized, the more helpful that can be. The IPCC for Working Group 2 for the 6th assessment report has a review coming up. For those of you with interest in time, the reviewers play such an important role in pointing to literature that the authors may not yet have picked up. You might consider signing up to be a reviewer. Another thing, as Emily said, be aware of the IPCC. The different working groups have different timelines for submission. Your literature is so important. Everything that I just talked about, if you could publish all of that and submit it by next May, that would just be perfect. And then, so for Working Group 2, and Leonard and others, please correct me if you have additional information, but submitted journal articles, the deadline is the beginning of May next year, 2020, and then published, peer-reviewed and published, at least going to be published, June 2021. And then the last one, we're almost done, is to engage with policy processes. You are all welcome in the UNFCCC. Many of you have personally spent many hours at our meetings, many days and even weeks. You're welcome, and you do make a difference. The conversations that you have with different representatives, bringing in your research, builds trust, and we need trust in order to pave the path together. So it's not just your ideas, but also your personal contribution is highly appreciated. We can have conversations afterwards about how you might get involved in the coming weeks, if you have time in the coming weeks. It's usually not too time intensive, but it does require engagement over, if you want to be effective, engagement over the years is great. So what does success look like in the end? If we could characterize the interacting adverse impacts of climate change, explore risk tolerance, provide research that is really helpful for decision support, you'll have informed policy. The uncertainty won't go away. It may grow, but you'll have policy that has a better chance of making changes. And what's really at stake are two things. For the scientific community, it's relevance. These changes out in the world are, in some cases, unfolding at a pace that's a bit surprising. You have countries moving their capitals. You have small island development states considering a revision of international maritime law so that the economic zones aren't defined by the national boundaries, which are defined by coasts, but by the continental shelf. You have so many really significant changes. Those two were just announced in the past half year, and I could go on and on. We're talking openly about population retreat in the country that I'm from. We're revising regional water laws, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things could be better with your contribution. And that's also said in humility because you're already contributing so much. But what success looks like is more specifics. If you're talking about finance under the UNFCCC, it's the difference from something that's kind of general, like we need support, to something that's more specific and maybe more constructive. What failure would look like is that science doesn't play a role in helping inform policy. Policy is going to have to make decisions, be it in the next few weeks or in the coming years, and you have a role to play in that. So in conclusion, we will, through this conference and through continuing engagement together, move from a cautionary tale to informed choices and pathways. We'll move from general to specific. We'll move from trauma to transformation, from knowledge to action, from work that is blind about values to work that is informed about what people care about. And really difficult, and this is all very difficult, but we'll move from resistance to change to helping to really build the future, as difficult as it will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Koko. We actually have some time for questions, and it's a great opportunity for Q&A from the audience. If you have specific questions to Koko on the policy context. Yeah, Rachel, back.
Thank you. It's on. Thank you, Koko. That was brilliant. Good call to action. You talked a lot about specificity, which I found really useful, but also quite challenging from a scientific perspective. And in particular, you said that it would be useful to characterize the impacts of climate change, what they look like in specificity. And I think a lot of my work on looking at, for example, changes in African rainfall and the associated impacts with that, there's so much associated uncertainty, and I'm wondering a bit more about what would be useful, how we can go from wide ranges of what might happen towards something more specific. And there's been some recent work around scenarios and storylines for communicating about climate change uncertainty. And do you think if we were to develop storylines of kind of hypothetical loss and damage, is that useful if it's more specific but without an associated probability, for example? Is that still useful?
Yes. In policy, some of you have been involved in creating the shared socioeconomic pathways literature. And these aren't necessarily yet buoyed up by modeling and evidence, and yet they're very, very useful. So when I talk about specifics, it may be that if you're writing a journal article, perhaps in the discussion, you can bring out some of these issues. You can't cover everything all at once. I recognize that. But literature that's more specific, either tagging things in abstracts or in the discussion section, do your research, of course, but then bring out additional things. What happens in the policy process is it is both evidence and modeling as well as imagination. And so, for example, typical questions that we hear from countries are about timing, where these things happen, how the level of severity, and those may be things that a particular, like your research, for example, Rachel, those may be things that for a particular research publication you may not have answers to, but you can discuss those in your discussion. And it's not me to tell you the details of your research, but more specificity, be that about geographies, time scales, factors that matter, sectors that matter, are helpful for the negotiators as well as their groups and countries.
Yes, Chad, the front.
Thank you, Koko, very much for the talk. I wanted to ask your perspective on what you see as the major challenge of achieving what I saw as kind of the core of the Warsaw International mechanism, and that's to find this coherent, integrative, and comprehensive approach to loss and damage. I think a lot of loss and damage research deals with these dichotomies between economic, non-economic, et cetera, as you talked about. So from your perspective, what do you see as one of the major challenges for achieving that core ambition of the Warsaw International mechanism?
There are at least 3 challenges. I'll just mention 3 that come to mind, but we could talk exactly about your question for a long, long time. What I've put up here is the purpose of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and then it has this executive committee that I told you about, but it has 3 functions. Overall, the purpose of this international mechanism is to help countries avert, minimize, and address the adverse impacts of climate change. And what we're talking about with these adverse impacts is really, in addition to all of the preemptive adaptation planning and implementation that is taking place in the world. So there are 3 functions. One is enhancing understanding and knowledge. One is strengthening dialogue, coordination, coherence, you mentioned that. And then enhancing action and support. For all of these functions, the greatest amount of work, ironically, because I get to be with you this week, the greatest amount of work is enhancing knowledge and understanding about what these things mean. And even there, you see how much more we have to learn. So there's a lot to be done. In terms of challenges, I'll mention 3. One is conceptual. One is about actors, and one is about architecture. So conceptually, I'll give an example. Yesterday, as part of our work, we have a workshop going on in Bonn today and yesterday about comprehensive risk management and data and risk assessment and systematic observation. And so it's a mixed crew, and there was a spectrum of perspectives. I was there yesterday, so it's going on today. So obviously it's a little narrow what I'm telling you, but there's one group especially from the contemporary disaster risk management community that's looking at risks in a spatially and geographically defined way. So you have risks to people and ecosystems in specific times and places. And then there's another spectrum that's almost what you were mentioning, Emily, almost existential, looking at just profound change. And do we think about profound change, systemic change that's not necessarily reversible? You're going from one state to another. Is that risk anymore, or is it something different? So we have conceptual challenges. And so when you're trying to create international policy about something that it's like wildly different perspectives, that's a big challenge. And that's a big challenge for getting coherence in policy. Another challenge are the actors. All of our institutions, be it nation states to your National Disaster Risk Management Authority or mayors, we're all organized according to the world as we know it. And all of us in our different roles, we're doing our jobs on a day-to-day basis for contemporary issues. And actually, a lot of our organizations were created and they were geared towards 20th century challenges. They haven't yet caught up to the kinds of emerging risks and issues that we're dealing with right now, are contemporary in the 21st century, let alone in the future. So agencies in the United Nations, I'll just take that because that's the family that I belong to, we're all looking for resources to do our work. Development cooperation and climate change and environment, et cetera. And we don't always have the same mandates. And we're trying to approach, let's say, sources of support to do the job that we're supposed to do today. And that sometimes gets in the way of coherence because we're trying to do different things. And then a third is architecture. An example that I will mention is cities. Cities, let's take a large mega city. Let's say, in some coastal area in Asia. People are flocking towards urban areas like these for lack of opportunity in other places, for education, jobs, et cetera. And some of those areas are increasingly exposed to climate disruptions, be they extreme events related to climate or other kind of interactions. So all of the architecture that UNFCCC is dealing with is about nation states. Cities are municipal and they're underneath a nation-state apparatus, but they have their decision-making, they have their pressures, they've got to build infrastructure, they've got to mitigate. And our current architecture doesn't necessarily link up the policy processes and where action needs to occur. That's just one of a whole number of challenges. So we have conceptual challenges, actor challenges, and architecture challenges. The architecture that we need in the future, which is why, by the way, I invited all of us to free ourselves from the constraints of current thinking, is because some years down the road, and it may not be very long, 5-10 years, the pressures that we're facing as a society are going to need kind of new ways of conceptualizing, potentially new actors or new combinations of actors. One wonderful thing, the promise of multidisciplinarity, is it helps us already start planting those seeds, and we'll most likely need additional or new architectures to deal with all of these interacting things. And I'm interested in your thoughts, even though I just talked so much.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. I have a quick one. Can I take it? Well, I have lots of questions, and we're going to have these 3 days to talk to you and talk to each other and really push these topics that you've brought up here. And I mean, I have questions around how, in the policy context, does the Executive Committee and Loss and Damage sit in relation to adaptation and mitigation? Is it an arena that people are seeing seriously as a third pillar of the negotiations as we talk about it in the research? Is that the case? And also questions around this fascinating interaction between research and science that you bring up, and this tension almost between freeing ourselves from the constraints to do the kinds of blue skies work, either within our disciplines or interdisciplinary, but also being aware of the policy context, the kinds of questions that policy needs to have addressed, and so on. And perhaps these are more topics that we can discuss as we go along, and perhaps come back to at the end of the conference as well, to see whether the science that we're talking about here is the stuff that is useful, but also unconstrained enough to come up with new ideas that can help the policy process also move things forward.
Yeah. I would just comment on a timeline. If all of you could draw a timeline in your mind from today out until approximately 2023. It should go way, way farther. But in terms of the UNFCCC process, there are different questions. We have this policy cycle, and I wouldn't constrain you as researchers to only do research for our cycle, but if you're publishing anyway, and you want to bring in your findings at particular points, timing is everything. So what you could do is think about what you want to contribute to out in the world. This is so naive. I beg your pardon for telling you this, because you know it. You're like, we're following you. But there is a timeline. So, for example, 2023 is our first global stock take after the Paris Agreement, which is way back over there. So this will be a time when most of the work streams, loss and damage, has been added by least developed countries. How are we doing with the goals of the Paris Agreement? And what would it need to look like? So between now and 2023, what kinds of contributions could you make from a research perspective that would help start answering some of those questions? And we're getting, as we go along, we're getting a better idea of the kinds of things that countries are already asking for that period. That stock take, by the way, goes every 5 years. So that's a whole cycle. Next year, 2020, the Conference of the Parties will meet in, I hope it's public because I've already said where it's going to be. But in 2020, one of the big topics will be finance. And where are we? One of the questions for us is, what would finance actually need to look like to help countries avert, minimize, and address? So you could basically just think of a timeline and anticipate, or we could chat about the kinds of questions that we're hearing countries ask. And again, in the UNFCCC, our main clients are countries, but there are additional really important stakeholders.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Koko. Another round of applause. Okay.